Tonight on Talking Politics, Marty Walsh is back on the political scene in Boston with an endorsement in the race for city council. What might this bode for Walsh's political future? We'll dig into that ahead. But first, it is getting harder and harder to afford a place to live in Massachusetts. If you're looking to buy, real estate company Point2 says more than half of all listings in Boston proper are over $1 million. Only 4 other cities also passed that mark, and they all happen to be in California. For renters, the picture isn't any better, with some of the most expensive rental prices in the country, according to data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the most expensive fair market rate for a one-bedroom of any state. State lawmakers have filed dozens of bills aimed at bringing prices down. Earlier this week, the legislature's Joint Committee on Housing held a hearing on nearly 20 of them. I'm joined now by the committee's Senate co-chair, State Senator Lydia Edwards, and by Caitlin Golden, Director of Public Policy for the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance. Thank you both for being here. Senator Edwards, I know that you and your colleagues are holding several hearings on matters involving housing right now. This one was focused on affordability, and I'm wondering, when you and your colleagues think about that issue, are you focused on the ability of the lowest income, most economically vulnerable residents of the state to get housing? Or is affordability something that applies to not just them, but people in maybe the middle class, and even in some cases the upper middle class as well?
It's an issue that used to be specifically about the folks who are the most vulnerable. But today, the way the prices are going, and it is now something that impacts our working class, middle class, and all income levels. It's a matter of not just being able to afford your first apartment, but being able to one day own a home. So being able to think about affordability in terms of that entire spectrum of economics, people trying to buy their first home aren't necessarily the most vulnerable, but in many cases, they're locked out of the system right now.
And I think, tell me if I've got this right, I believe the Mass Budget and Policy Center put out a study within the last week or two saying that most of the people moving out of Massachusetts, and we have this drain going on right now, it's mostly not high wage earners, right? But people earning, I believe, under $200,000?
Correct. Many people are finding that they cannot take up roots in Massachusetts like they used to. Graduating from college, graduating from graduate school, getting your first job, and that's usually where you can get your starter home or your starter apartment, and they are out of reach. In many cases, they're leaving to start someplace else, and that's a huge loss to the state.
Senator, I want to ask you about the diagnosis of this problem that Governor Reilly offered in her inaugural speech earlier this year. I'm curious about whether you agree with the way she sized it up. Let's take a look at what she had to say back in January.
The cost of housing is out of control for too many because we simply don't have enough of it. If we want Massachusetts to be a home for all, we need to build more places to live, and we need to make sure those homes are within reach.
Senator Edwards, does that way of conceptualizing the problem square with your own, or do you part ways with the governor in terms of how you understand this issue?
Quite to the contrary. I do not part ways with the governor. I think she has demonstrated the ability to see the issue on many fronts, not just build more housing, but create a whole department dedicated to housing people, all people, and making sure that folks who have disabilities, who have families, and so on and so forth are part of that conversation. Where I would say that if there is any difference, or I'm finishing the sentence, it's we need to build more housing at various income levels and be conscious about that. What is the average income in Boston is totally different than Springfield, is different than Fitchburg.
Yeah.
And you need to build for the communities that you're in to house the people who are living there.
Caitlin Golden, your organization, tell me if I've got this right, is focused on ending homelessness for unaccompanied adults, adults who do not live with other people, do not live with children. How big is that problem right now in Massachusetts for that population?
It's a big problem. As you heard and as the senator mentioned, we're in a housing crisis right now for all income levels, but that particularly impacts the most vulnerable. So people who are experiencing homelessness, many of whom may have complex behavioral health, medical issues that they're facing. We have preliminary numbers for the January 2023 point-in-time count, counting people who are experiencing homelessness, and those preliminary numbers are showing an increase of about 23% of unsheltered homelessness. So that means people living in encampments and on the streets. So we're clearly not going in the right direction on that, and we really need to make some change.
Is that an increase of 23% compared to this point in time last year?
Last year,
That's
yes.
an enormous increase. And do you have a sense of what the total size of that population might be right now? Are we talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands?
So for the January 2022 point-in-time count, which is what we have the most fullest numbers on, it was around 15,000 people experiencing homelessness in Massachusetts, and of that, around 5,000 who are unaccompanied adults.
One of the points you raised, and I believe, tell me if I've got this right too, you testified to the Senators Committee last month?
That's correct.
Correct, at a different hearing. One of the points that you raised in your testimony that I was kind of flabbergasted by is that at this point in time, there is no state forecast looking ahead, projecting what the total number of people who are homeless, unaccompanied homeless, other types of homeless people, what the total number is going to be on any given year moving forward, and what the shelter demand is going to be. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're at a point right now where we are making progress, and the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities is making progress on getting together the data around people experiencing homelessness, but we really need a plan. We need benchmarks. We need to be able to forecast what the need is for shelter and for permanent housing across the state.
Why is it, and I'm going to show my naivete here, and Caitlin, you can answer, Senator, you can answer, but why would it be that that sort of plan wouldn't have been created? Because when I saw that piece of your testimony, again, my jaw kind of dropped. I think would have assumed that a plan like that would have been in place.
Yeah, and I think there have been smaller plans, more local plans across the state, and various communities have worked on local planning. I think that we're in a position in the state where we have 12 different continuums of care, so 12 different regional entities who are working on addressing homelessness, all with different data systems. And so it's a project to get everyone's data feeding to the right place and making sure we're using that data effectively to plan. Representative Higgins and Senator Feeney have filed a bill to ask the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities to do just that, to make a plan about future shelter need, future housing need, and really prioritize permanent housing and non-congregate shelter.
Senator Edwards, I think I might have seen you nodding out of the corner of my eye. Do you remember what you were nodding at?
Before I was senator, before I was city councilor, I worked with the Office of Housing Stability in the city of Boston, and so dealing with housing crisis. And what we noticed is that it is not any one city or any one community's conversation. It can't just be Boston that is dealing with this, because so many of the people who were unsheltered were not from Boston, but in Boston. And so it was a constant conversation with different resources, different understanding of homelessness, different understanding of whether they should even deal with it. Some cities and towns do not want to acknowledge that they have a problem. And so it is all of those different headspaces that then result in the lack of planning, the lack of cohesive understanding that we all have to do something. And it ends up with us finally starting to have this conversation. So I'm nodding because the disjointed conversation that we've had for decades is what has led to this crisis moment.
That makes a lot of sense. Senator, I know, again, that you are in the midst of hearings on this very big and very thorny issue. I said to the two of you before we got rolling here that I realized when I was getting questions ready that we really need like 4 or 5 hours to talk through this stuff as opposed to the 15 minutes that we have here. That being said, are there any big ideas that are coming up again and again in the hearings that you're holding, in the bills that are crossing your desk, that you think are likely to be reflected in some way, shape, or form with whatever, or in whatever action the legislature ends up taking on housing in this session?
Well, the big action that I'm seeing, and I'm watching both the House and Senate have pushed forward for housing production incentives, such as HDIP, which is a tax incentive to local municipalities, and really pumping in a lot of money to assure that there's an actual backlog of units to be built. One of the criticisms is that a lot of those units are market rate. But if the city and town has a local IDP or inclusionary zoning that requires affordable housing, they'll be part of that as well. But the point is, one of the biggest things that I can say we can all agree on is to produce more units. So that is something that I think I'm excited to see the House and Senate have similar language, and also see that the governor has led on that as well. Other protections and other things that I'm watching, again, the House, the Senate, and the governor kind of move on is assuring what we need to do more than anything is keep people in the homes that they have. We need to invest in public housing in a huge infrastructure way to assure that, people don't, the best way to keep people out of a shelter system is to keep them in the homes that they have. And so revamping and looking at the shelter system, also decommissioning certain colleges, college dorms, and looking at places where we can put people that are already built is huge. And finally, I think the biggest chorus is really making sure that the law that we pass, the MBTA zoning law, that is robust and enforceable, and getting cities and towns to again, contribute to building housing. In terms of other policies, there's a lot of tenant protections that I think are very much something that people are looking at, including eviction ceiling, including opportunity to purchase. There are a lot of really good things that are still I guess we're still working on in terms of having hearings and conversations. But what I see is a collective excitement and money and energy around getting more units out there.
Caitlin, one of the themes that seemed to me to be a continuum in the hearing that the senator and her colleagues held this week was the idea that the affordability issue impacts some groups more than others disproportionately, and that solutions, when it comes to finding housing for those groups, solutions need to be really tailored specifically to their particular needs. And one of the groups that came up throughout the course of this most recent hearing was disabled individuals. For the people that you work with on a regular basis, to what extent do disabled individuals or people living with disabilities comprise a big chunk of that population?
Yeah, working with people who have experienced particularly chronic homelessness, long-term homelessness, having disabling conditions such as medical issues, behavioral health issues, those challenges need support. And a housing response for that population needs to involve supportive housing, which is putting someone into housing and providing the wraparound supports, behavioral health, medical supports, in order to help them stay in that housing. It's called housing first, the idea that someone doesn't have to deserve housing.
Right, which we heard a lot about in connection with the ongoing situation at Mass and Cass, and I know Mayor Wu is trying to do that. I should ask you, because, and we're talking about a whole, this just shows how big the problem is. We're talking about a bunch of different types of housing here, from market rate to affordable new housing to existing housing to shelter housing that you'd like to see built. Do you have a sense, Caitlin, of how much it would cost, or how much it might cost to build congregate and non-congregate, more private housing for homeless individuals in the state and get them housed in a housing first model? Like what sort of investment?
Yeah, well, so what I can say is we've talked about, and I think there's general agreement that Massachusetts is short around 200,000 units that need to be created by 2030. And of that, I think we'd say around 10,000 of that need to be supportive housing. And the thing about supportive housing is that it's an investment that is actually very cost effective. So once you are putting someone in supportive housing, there are significant decreases in Medicaid costs, so emergency care, acute care. And so what we're finding is there's actually savings that result from putting people in housing. And so you need to have funding models that are flexible funding models that can provide operating, service, and capital dollars to build the supportive housing, and then that really ends up saving the state money.
And do those models exist at this point in time?
They do. So we have it, but what we really need is to bring to scale. Representative Moschino and Senator Creighton have filed a bill to create a flexible supportive housing pool subsidy program. And the idea is, how do we really scale up? It's very difficult to create supportive housing. Providers end up going to multiple different sources of funding, trying to cobble together a project. And what we need is flexible, intentional funding that really brings the model to scale.
Senator Edwards, you mentioned the MBTA communities law a couple minutes ago, and that was actually something I wanted to ask you about. As you know much better than me, that law, which was one of the biggest ideas to come out of the Baker administration and the legislature under former Governor Baker, that law has elicited some pushback from some communities that seem to not want to go along with the terms it laid down. Has that pushback made any of your colleagues in the legislature leery of trying to push communities harder on this front? Because obviously, people are sensitive to local concerns, and if you have residents saying, we don't like what this is doing, we don't want to go along with it, I would imagine that it could make some legislators apprehensive. Is it?
It could, but I think by having it be the law, it has really provided whatever cover a lot of my colleagues may need. It's the law. You have to comply with it. The Attorney General has made clear that she is also willing to help lend a shoulder into making sure that some cities and towns also comply with it. For many of my colleagues and for many local elected officials, this was the breath of fresh air that they needed to turn to their local select boards or zoning commissions and say, it's not an option anymore. You have to build. They needed this extra push. They lowered the barrier for being able to afford housing from 2/3 to simple majority, to be able to approve housing. These were the pushes that a lot of people needed, and unfortunately needed to come top down to get it done. So in many cases, I think a lot of my colleagues saw this as a breath of fresh air, so they can turn around and say, listen, here's an incentive with HDIB and tax incentives to make it actually cost worthy for folks to invest in your city and town. Here are other ways in which we can do, multi-use zoning. It's really been what a lot of cities and towns have been craving for, is this opportunity to amplify that we need more housing everywhere.
I should ask one more question. I'd be remiss if I didn't before I let both of you go. Senator Edwards, what's the state right now of the rent control or rent stabilization conversation at Beacon Hill?
The conversation is scheduled, I think, for October 30th. So we will have it'll be part of the many bills that we have that day as well, where I think the conversation will really kick off. There'll be a massive amount of wonderful advocates on both sides coming in. They have come in already. The advocates for rent control and rate stabilization have been to the State House in many cases, really emphasizing the sense of urgency that the rents are not affordable and they're not getting more affordable with the system that we have right now. And so we'll come in and we will hear, by then I'm hearing we might have other home rule petitions. Boston is the only one right now. We might have other cities and towns also pushing through their own version of rent stabilization. And then we will have that collective conversation and it'll go through the same process that all the other bills do.
Okay, thank you. Caitlin Golden, you get the last question really quickly. What's the best thing for the people you work with that the legislature could do in this session?
Investing in flexible funding for permanent supportive housing. That's really what we need. We need to scale up our supportive housing and have it be efficiently funded, flexibly funded.
All right, Caitlin Golden, Senator Lydia Edwards, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Next up, former Boston Mayor Marty Walsh has been dipping his toes back into the turbulent waters of city politics, throwing his support behind his former staffer, John Fitzgerald, who's running for an open seat on the city council. It is Walsh's first formal endorsement since he left City Hall for the Biden administration and then stepped down as labor secretary earlier this year to become the head of the NHL Players Union. Since then, according to David Bernstein in Boston Magazine, Walsh seems to be in the Boston public eye more and more, raising questions about the former mayor's future in the city and its politics. David joins me now, along with the managing editor of the Dorchester Reporter, Gin Dumpsius. Great to see you both. So David, the piece was a super fun read, and I'm thrilled you can be here to talk about it. What were the events that you put together that made you say, Marty Walsh has never been entirely gone from Boston, but he's raising his profile lately. What's he been doing?
Well, part of it is that he was deliberately staying out of the limelight, both because of Hatch Act sorts of, when you're working for the federal government, but also he really did see himself as needing to step back to give the new mayor, both Kim Janey and then Michelle Wu, some space, not overshadow them. But then this year, we've seen him give some speeches. I mentioned one that he gave to New England Council in South Boston. He threw out the first pitch at Dorchester Little League. He gave a commencement speech at Suffolk Law, those kinds of things. And he's just been showing up. I've been hearing more and more about, I saw Marty Walsh at this event, that event. It just seemed that he's more in the spotlight. Obviously, he's in town more. He never really moved to Washington, but he was there during the week. So now he's in Boston more, even though he is technically working for a Canadian company.
You mentioned good point. You mentioned he never stopped getting his hair cut at the same barber in the North End, right? Even when he was labor secretary, he was still going to Salem Street to get a haircut?
Yep, that's right. I double-checked that with him. I had a nice conversation with him about how he stayed in touch with Boston. He still continued to go to, he's in Alcoholics Anonymous, as he's talked about publicly, and he continued to go to his meetings here, in Boston. His regular things. He spent the week in hotel rooms in D.C. He also traveled the country a lot as labor secretary, but he stayed very much grounded and continued, by the way, to get phone calls from people for help on any number of issues.
Again, in David's piece, he quotes Walsh talking about his relationship to Mayor Wu and her shifting course compared to his administration in various areas. David quotes Walsh saying, effectively, you got to roll with that. If you've been mayor, your successor comes in, does different things. You want him to succeed. You don't let it ruffle your feathers. And yet, David also links to a piece that you wrote for The Reporter back when Walsh gave this speech to the New England Council, in which he seemed to be maybe doing something a little different there. Can you just recount for people who might not have caught it what he said in that speech and what it might have indicated about how he receives criticism from Mayor Wu?
Sure. Well, it was in front of the New England Council, which is a business-backed group run by Jim Brett, who used to be a state rep and ran for mayor as well against Menino. Secretary Walsh spoke at that event, and it came a few days after Mayor Wu's State of the Union, where she was, didn't mention the Walsh administration, but there was a lot of criticism in that speech in terms of development. And, what struck me about that speech is it kind of like slowly dawned on me as I was listening to it was, he was offering this defense of his administration. And I talked to people in the room afterwards, a politically savvy crowd, and that was their read too, which was interesting. And this was before the NHL hockey news came out. At that point, he was in the mix for potentially White House chief of staff. So there was a question of what does he do next? Does he stay at the White House? Does he stay, or what does he do next? So that was kind of the interesting dynamic that was happening there.
I think you were the first person to report that he is endorsing in this city council race. Can you tell people who might not be familiar with the race, who's he endorsing and why is he backing this particular candidate?
Sure. So the person he's endorsing is John Fitzgerald, who works for the Boston Planning and Development Agency. John Fitzgerald is also the son of Kevin Fitzgerald, a longtime Mission Hill state rep who passed away, in 2007, I believe. And Walsh actually shared an office at the State House with Rep. Fitzgerald. They were both in recovery as well. So they bonded over that. And Walsh obviously hired the younger Fitzgerald when he became mayor. So Fitzgerald has been a key part of the Walsh kind of circle since then.
And he's running to replace Frank Baker, and Walsh is actually going to be knocking on doors for him this weekend, right?
Yes, they'll be in Savin Hill and Dorchester, Walsh's old neighborhood, as well as Frank Baker's.
That's a nice boost for Fitzgerald to get. David, you point out in your piece that, at least in some quarters, there is this ongoing dream of Walsh coming back and running for mayor again against Michelle Wu. You kick the tires on that and decide that that's not going to happen, right? You think we can rule that out?
Well, I think it's a bit of a pipe dream. I'd be interested if Ginn has been hearing similar things to what I heard, which is really from the business, finance, development kind of circles. People who spent a lot of money opposing Michelle Wu in the 2021 mayoral election and certainly would be eager, certainly do not have fonder feelings toward her in office, and would certainly love for a white knight to come in and run against her in 2025. I don't see him wanting to do that. If nothing else, he's signed up with this Players Association. The NHL current bargaining agreement runs, I believe, through the 2025-26 season. So he'll be working on that contract. I can't imagine him bailing before that unless maybe Biden called him back for some reason.
He'd have to take a pretty enormous pay cut, too, to switch
Well,
from
that's
that
true.
job to potentially being mayor again. Gin, does that square with stuff that you've been hearing, that this is not, even if some people love this idea of a Walsh-Wu race, it's not something that we're going to see?
Yeah, I mean, I've been hearing other names instead. I can't really, still reporting those out, but, you know.
Shoot, I really want to hear those. Well, when the camera stops rolling.
Well, there are a lot of rumors out there, and there's names that are getting floated, and then, you know, you call or you talk to someone close with that person, and it turns out, no, that's not true. So I think there's, I mean, you know, Boston politics, people love to talk. They love to gossip.
Yeah, here we are.
Here we are. So it's one of those things where, you know, we'll see. I mean, the mayoral election is not that far away. You know, the city council elections are this fall. You know, if someone was to mount a challenge, they'd have to get started pretty early, just as Mayor Wu did herself in, I believe it was September 2020 is when she launched her campaign.
She did get going early. All right, well, obviously that raises the question, if Walsh is probably not going to run for his old job again, what do you think we might reasonably speculate that he could do in the future in the world of politics? Because, David, one of my big takeaways from your piece was that, and you know, again, I would guess that you would agree with this, based on your own reporting, he loves this stuff, right? It's the water he's swum in for decades. It's a big part of who he is. So is it safe to assume, do you think, that he's got another run in him for some higher office down the road? And if so, what would it be? David, why don't you go first, and then we'll get Gin's thoughts.
Well, I think that he definitely would consider something. Timing is everything in politics, as we know. I think that he was interested, certainly, in running for governor after Baker, but it just wasn't in the cards for him. So I think governor would be something if it was available at the right time. Remember, he's still pretty young. He's 55. U.S. Senate. I also hear from a lot of people, and people can take this as they want, but the possibility that he could be on a national ticket, a vice presidential nominee. Again, you know, take that for what you want. You can certainly see what the advantages would be, and he has a national presence now, and certainly a national labor presence. But I think it's timing. You know, I think at this point he's done the things he wants to do. Now he'll come and take opportunities where they come.
All right, Ken, you're going to get the last word here. What do you hear about what Walsh might want to do politically down the road?
Well, I would agree with David that timing is a lot of things in politics, and it kind of depends. And I heard the same things, that he was interested in running for governor. Obviously, that didn't work out. But you know, he's a young guy. We'll see what happens. And my sense was, when he became mayor, he wasn't going to stay there as long as Menino did. I think he's open to a lot of things. But you know, it's like when you're in the private sector and you're making, you know, that kind of money, it's kind of hard to give that up to go back into public life.
It would at least make it easier to be patient about your time, right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Gin Dumpsius, David Bernstein, thank you both for being here. Enjoyed it. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And please tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website's gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter @ReillyAdam. For now, thanks for watching, and good night.
Sneaking off, are you?